The scent of aged bourbon mingled with light perfume as Margaret Lawson sat alone at the corner table of Le Ciel Bleu, a small but elegant bistro in downtown Boston. At 67, she cut a striking figure. Silver hair styled in a fashionable bob that framed high cheekbones, bright blue eyes that had lost none of their intensity over the decades, and the kind of poise that came from decades of teaching literature at one of the city's most prestigious universities. Tonight, she was celebrating her retirement alone. Her colleagues had thrown her a formal party earlier that week, full of speeches and champagne toasts, but this evening was just for her, a quiet acknowledgement of stepping into a new chapter. She'd ordered the chef's tasting menu and a glass of bourbon, savoring each bite as she reflected on a life well lived, a successful academic career, 2 grown children who had families of their own, and 27 years of marriage to a man she had deeply loved until cancer took him 5 years ago. "Excuse me," a deep voice interrupted her reverie. "Is this seat taken?" Margaret looked up to find a tall, broad-shouldered black man gesturing to the empty chair across from her. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that accentuated his athletic build, with a crisp white shirt open at the collar. His close-cropped hair was beginning to show the faintest traces of silver at the temples, though Margaret estimated he couldn't be much over 35. "I believe there are plenty of empty tables," she replied, gesturing around the half-vacant restaurant. He smiled, revealing perfect white teeth. "There are, but none with such interesting company." The boldness of his approach should have put her off, but there was something in his warm brown eyes that sparked her curiosity. "Do you always flirt with women old enough to be your mother?" she asked, her voice carrying a hint of amusement. "Only the exceptional ones," he replied without missing a beat. "Andre Jackson," he introduced himself, extending his hand. After a moment's hesitation, she took it. "Margaret Lawson." "May I join you, Professor Lawson?" he asked, his eyes twinkling. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "How did you know I'm a professor?" "I didn't," Andre admitted. "But there's something about the way you're observing everything, taking mental notes, analyzing. Teachers have that look." "Former professor," Fick corrected, "as of last week." "Then this is a celebration," he said, flagging down the waiter. "May I buy you another drink to mark the occasion?" Against her better judgment, Margaret nodded. 1 drink became 2, and conversation flowed with surprising ease. Andre was articulate and thoughtful, a jazz musician who had studied at Berklee College of Music and now taught there part-time while performing regularly at clubs throughout the city. They discovered a shared love of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, debated the merits of various jazz pianists, and compared notes on their favorite hidden corners of Boston. "Why did you really approach me tonight?" Margaret asked as the restaurant began to empty around them. "Surely there are plenty of young women who would be thrilled to have your attention." Andre's expression grew serious. "Because when I walked in and saw you sitting here, something told me you were someone worth knowing." He hesitated, then added, "And because you remind me of someone who once changed my life. My first piano teacher." She had that same look of quiet dignity mixed with just a hint of rebellion. Margaret laughed softly. "Rebellion? At my age?" "Age has nothing to do with the fire inside," Andre said, his eyes holding hers. "Some people never had it. Others never lose it." When they finally left the restaurant, Boston had transformed into a canvas of night shadows and city lights. Andre offered to walk her home, and Margaret accepted, telling herself it was merely practical safety in the city after dark. At her doorstep, a beautifully maintained brownstone in Back Bay, they paused. "I'd like to see you again," Andre said simply, no pretense in his voice. Margaret regarded him with a mixture of amusement and wariness. "This is either a very elaborate prank or a serious lapse in judgment on your part. Or maybe it's just one human being who'd like to spend more time with another interesting human being," he countered. "Let me take you to hear some real jazz tomorrow night. No expectations, just music and conversation." Perhaps it was the bourbon, or the heady freedom of retirement, or simply the intriguing novelty of being seen, truly seen, by this handsome young man. Whatever the reason, Margaret found herself agreeing. The jazz club was intimate and smoky, tucked away in a basement off Massachusetts Avenue. Andre knew everyone, greeting the bartender and musicians with easy familiarity. He guided Margaret to a corner table with the perfect view of the small stage, his hand lightly resting at the small of her back, a casual touch that nonetheless sent an unexpected shiver through her. The bassist is an old friend from Berkeley, Andre explained as they settled in with their drinks. He's been trying to get this quartet together for years. The music was raw and vibrant, filling the space with complex rhythms and soulful improvisations. Margaret found herself transported, her foot tapping along, occasionally catching Andre's eye when a particularly beautiful phrase caught their attention. In these shared moments of musical appreciation, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of mutual understanding that transcended their obvious differences. After the show, they walked along the river, the city lights reflecting on the dark water. When Andre's fingers brushed against hers, Margaret didn't pull away. Instead, to her own surprise, she found herself entwining her fingers with his, the warmth of his hand a stark contrast to the cool night air. "This is mad," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "Is it?" Andre stopped walking, turning to face her. "Or is it just unexpected?" Before she could answer, he leaned down and kissed her, softly at first, then with growing intensity as she responded. Margaret felt a rush of sensations she had thought long dormant, the quickening of her pulse, the warmth spreading through her body, the delicious disorientation of desire. When they broke apart, Margaret looked up at him, her composure momentarily shattered. "I'm 67 years old, Andre." "And I'm 34, he replied calmly. "Now that we've stated the obvious, may I kiss you again?" She laughed, a sound of both disbelief and delight, before reaching up to pull his face down to hers. That night, Margaret invited Andre into her home and her bed. In the soft glow of her bedside lamp, she initially felt a moment of self-consciousness as she unbuttoned her blouse, revealing skin that bore the inevitable marks of 6 decades of life. But the desire in Andre's eyes as he looked at her was unmistakable, and when he whispered, "You're beautiful," against her neck, she allowed herself to believe him. Their lovemaking was both tender and passionate, a rediscovery for Margaret of pleasure she had thought belonged to her past. Andre's touch was reverent yet assured, his body strong and responsive against hers. But afterward, as they lay tangled in her sheets, Margaret tried to make sense of what had just happened. "This can't possibly be more than a temporary diversion for you," she said, her hand resting on his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heart. "Why not?" Andre propped himself up on one elbow, studying her face in the dim light. "Because society says so. I've never been particularly interested in society's rules about who should love whom." "It's not just society," Margaret sighed. "It's reality. I've lived a full life already. You're still building yours." "Then maybe I want to build part of it with you," he replied, "for however long that might be." In the days that followed, Margaret found herself swept into a relationship that defied all her expectations of how her retirement would unfold. Andre became a regular presence in her home, bringing his saxophone to practice while she read or graded the last papers from her final semester. They cooked together, argued about literature, made love, and gradually, hesitantly, began to weave their lives together. The outside world, however, was not as accepting of their relationship as they were. The first time they encountered one of Margaret's colleagues while dining out, the woman's poorly disguised shock made Margaret acutely aware of how they must appear to others. When Andre introduced Margaret to some of his musician friends, she caught the knowing smirks they exchanged, as if she were a predictable midlife crisis for a younger man. The most difficult reactions came from Margaret's children. Her daughter Elizabeth, always the more diplomatic of the two, expressed her concerns during a tense Sunday lunch. "Mom, I'm trying to understand, but you have to see how this looks," she said, stirring her coffee with unnecessary vigor. "He's younger than I am." "And that makes him unsuitable?" Margaret asked, keeping her voice even despite the anger bubbling beneath the surface. "That makes me wonder what he wants from you," Elizabeth replied. "You have the house, your retirement fund, Dad's life insurance. If you spend 5 minutes actually talking to Andre, instead of making assumptions, you know he has his own career and financial stability," Margaret said sharply. "I may be older, but I'm not a fool, Elizabeth." Her son James was less tactful during a phone call that same week. "For God's sake, Mom, he's black and half your age. Do you have any idea what people are saying? What are you thinking?" The question lodged in Margaret's mind, persistent and uncomfortable. What was she thinking? Was this a desperate grasp at fading youth, a rebellion against the loneliness of widowhood, or something more authentic? Andre, for his part, seemed unfazed by the opposition they faced. People talk because they're uncomfortable with whatever doesn't fit into their narrow boxes, he told her one night as they lay in bed, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. But their discomfort isn't our problem. Isn't it, though? Margaret sighed. When it affects the people we care about? They'll adjust, Andre said with a confidence that both impressed and worried her. What matters is what's real between us. And this, he pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple, is very real to me. Their relationship deepened as summer turned to autumn. Margaret attended Andre's performances, learning to ignore the curious stares and whispers that followed them. Andre accompanied her to the symphony, to art exhibitions, to quiet dinners in upscale restaurants where the staff's professionalism couldn't quite mask their surprise at the couple. But it was in the privacy of Margaret's home that their connection truly flourished. There, away from judging eyes, they discovered each other's bodies with unhurried deliberation. Margaret marveled at the smooth strength of Andre's shoulders, the elegance of his pianist's hands, the way his dark skin contrasted with her paler, softer flesh. She learned that desire didn't diminish with age. If anything, the awareness of time's finite nature made each touch more precious, each moment of intimacy more profound. For his part, Andre seemed genuinely captivated by Margaret's body, with all its signs of a life well lived. Where she saw wrinkles, he saw character. Where she felt self-conscious about softness, he found sensuality. "You're real," he told her once, his voice husky with emotion. Do you know how rare that is? To be with someone who inhabits their body without pretense or performance? Their physical connection was only one facet of what they shared. Margaret found in Andre an intellectual equal, someone whose perspective, shaped by different experiences, different generations, challenged and expanded her own thinking. He, in turn, valued her wisdom and insight, often seeking her counsel on career decisions or creative dilemmas. "You see things clearly," he told her once, "without all the noise and distraction that clouds most people's judgment." "That's just age," Margaret laughed. "When you've seen as many mistakes as I have, made plenty of them yourself, patterns start to emerge." "It's more than that," Andre insisted. "It's a kind of integrity. You don't bend to accommodate other people's expectations." The irony wasn't lost on Margaret. Her relationship with Andre represented the first time in her life she had truly defied societal norms. She had always been the proper one, the reliable one, following the expected path from good student to respected professor, devoted wife, responsible mother. Now, in her 7th decade, she found herself living in a way that shocked the very community she had been part of for so long. The situation came to a head during the university's annual holiday gala. Though retired, Margaret had been invited as an honored guest, having dedicated 4 decades to the institution. She had initially planned to attend alone, but Andre insisted on accompanying her. "These are your people," he said. "Your life's work. I want to be part of that." Margaret agreed with trepidation. The evening began pleasantly enough, with former colleagues greeting her warmly, if with slight surprise at her companion. But as the night wore on, she became increasingly aware of the speculative glances, the whispered comments behind hands, the barely concealed judgment. "Margaret, darling," cooed Frances Whitmore, a fellow professor emerita with whom Margaret had shared an office for nearly 20 years. "How adventurous of you." Her gaze slid to Andre, who had stepped away to get them drinks. "Though I must say, if I were to take a younger lover, I'd have the decency to be discreet about it." The comment stung like a slap. Before Margaret could respond, Andre returned, handing her a glass of champagne and placing his hand lightly at the small of her back, a gesture that now felt like a declaration in the charged atmosphere. "Andre, this is Frances Whitmore," Margaret said, her voice steadier than she felt. "We taught together for many years." Professor Whitmore, Andre extended his hand with perfect courtesy. "Margaret speaks highly of your work on medieval women's literature." Francis shook his hand limply. "How flattering to know I come up in conversation." Her smile was brittle. "Tell me, young man, what exactly is your Margaret?" Andre's expression didn't change, but Margaret felt him tense beside her. "I'm not sure I understand your question, Professor," he said coolly. "Francis," Margaret cut in, her patience finally exhausted. "Andre and I are together. There's no arrangement beyond what any two people who care deeply for each other might have." Francis raised an eyebrow. "Care deeply? How quaint. I simply find it hard to believe that a man his age would be interested in a woman your age without additional motivations." Margaret felt heat rise to her face, not the blush of embarrassment, but the flush of pure anger. "Perhaps that says more about your imagination than it does about our relationship," she replied, her voice carrying just enough to draw attention from nearby conversations. "If you'll excuse us." Taking Andre's arm, she led him away, her heart pounding. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "I knew this was a mistake." "The mistake was mine," Andre said grimly. "I thought your colleagues would be more open-minded given their education. I didn't mean to subject you to that." Margaret stopped walking, turning to face him in the middle of the elegantly decorated ballroom. Around them, conversations hushed as people noticed their apparent disagreement. "You have nothing to apologize for," she said clearly. "Neither of us does." Then, in a move that surprised even herself, Margaret reached up, placed her hands on either side of Andre's face, and kissed him. Not a brief peck, but a deep, passionate kiss that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. When they broke apart, the silence around them was deafening. "I believe we've made our point," Margaret said, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Shall we go home?" Andre's eyes were alight with a mixture of surprise and admiration. "Lead the way, Professor." That night marked a turning point. Having publicly acknowledged their relationship, Margaret felt a curious liberation. They began to live more openly, less concerned with others' reactions. When the inevitable gossip circulated, Margaret's former department chair implied to her son that Andre must be after her money. One of Andre's musician friends made crude jokes about his thing for cougars. They faced it together, with a united front of dignified indifference. Their relationship was not without its challenges, of course. The difference in their energy levels sometimes caused friction. Margaret might prefer a quiet evening at home when Andre was eager to go out after a performance. Cultural references often missed their mark. Movies Margaret considered recent had come out before Andre was born, while his musical touchstones were sometimes unfamiliar to her. More significantly, they faced practical questions about their future. Margaret was well aware of the statistical realities. As the older partner, she would likely face health issues before Andre, potentially becoming dependent rather than equal. The thought troubled her deeply. "I don't want to become your burden," she confessed one night as they lay together, the moonlight casting soft shadows across their entwined figures. "The thought of you as my caretaker rather than my lover, I couldn't bear it." Andre propped himself up on one elbow, his expression serious in the dim light. "Life comes with no guarantees, Margaret. Young people get sick. Accidents happen. We're all just one diagnosis away from dependency." "That's not the same thing as the inevitable march of time," she argued. "Be realistic." "I am being realistic," he insisted. "Realistically, all any of us have is now, this moment, and I choose to spend my moments with you, whatever comes next." As their first year together approached, they took a trip to Paris, a city Margaret had visited many times throughout her academic career, but never with Andre. They rented a small apartment in the Marais, spending their days wandering through museums, lingering over wine at sidewalk cafes, and their nights making love with the windows open to the sounds of the city. It was there, in a small bistro near the Seine, that Andre surprised her with a simple platinum band. "This isn't a conventional proposal," he said, holding the ring between them. "I know you might not want to marry again, and I respect that, but I want you to know that I'm committed to you, to us, for whatever time we have." Margaret looked at the ring, then at Andre's face, so earnest and open. Her first instinct was to refuse, to protect him from what she still believed was an inevitable disappointment. But something in his eyes, a certainty, a clarity of purpose, gave her pause. "Are you sure?" she asked quietly. "Truly sure." "I've never been more certain of anything," he replied. "I love you, Margaret. Not despite your age, not as some exotic experiment, but for exactly who you are." She took the ring, slipping it onto her finger. It felt both strange and right, a weight she had not expected to bear again. "Then yes," she said simply. "Yes to whatever this is, whatever it becomes." They didn't have a formal wedding, opting instead for a small civil ceremony attended only by Andre's parents, who had surprised Margaret with their warm acceptance, and her daughter Elizabeth, who had gradually come to respect, if not fully understand, her mother's choice. James declined to attend, still uncomfortable with what he called her late-life crisis. The newspapers called it an unconventional union. Social media buzzed briefly with photos and commentary, most of it unkind. Margaret's former university colleagues were divided, some offering genuine congratulations, others distancing themselves with tight smiles and vague excuses. Through it all, Margaret and Andre remained focused on building their life together, a life that increasingly centered around shared creativity. Andre's music took on new dimensions, influenced by Margaret's literary sensibilities. She, in turn, began writing again after decades of academic publishing, producing essays about love, aging, and the unexpected turns of life that found an enthusiastic audience online. They traveled when Andre wasn't performing, dividing their time between Boston and the small cottage Margaret owned on Cape Cod. They entertained friends who accepted them as they were, a gradually expanding circle of artists, musicians, writers, and academics who valued authenticity above conformity. And in the quiet moments when doubts crept in, when Margaret caught sight of herself in the mirror and wondered what this vital young man saw in her aging face, or when Andre faced yet another tiresome joke about mother issues from a stranger, they found solace in the truth they had discovered together. That love, at its core, is simply the recognition of another soul that speaks to yours, regardless of the vessels that contain them. "What will you do when I'm gone?" Margaret asked once, giving voice to the fear that still occasionally haunted her. They were sitting on the deck of the Cape Cod cottage, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. Andre took her hand, his fingers warm against her skin. "The same thing anyone does when they lose someone they love," he replied. "I'll grieve. I'll remember. I'll be grateful for every moment we had. And I'll keep living, because that's what you would want for me." Margaret nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "I would, want you to be happy." "I know." He squeezed her hand. "But let's not borrow trouble from the future. We have now. This sunset, this moment, let's not waste it on worry." As the light faded from the sky, Margaret leaned her head against Andre's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him beside her. Society might never fully understand or accept what they had found together. Her son might never reconcile himself to her choice. Strangers would continue to stare, to whisper, to make assumptions. But in this moment, with the ocean stretching before them and the first stars appearing in the darkening sky, none of that mattered. What mattered was the beat of Andre's heart beneath her hand, the gentle sound of his breathing, the knowledge that in all the vast complexity of human existence, they had found each other across boundaries of age and race and expectation, and chosen, deliberately and with clear eyes, to love. And in that choice, Margaret had discovered something she had not expected in the autumn of her life. Not a desperate grasping at youth, not a denial of time's passage, but a profound affirmation that the capacity for passion, for connection, for beginning anew never truly fades, as long as one has the courage to embrace it.